On a cool Thursday evening in Portland, Oregon, Eric sat at his desk in the living room, surrounded by papers, his laptop open to a spreadsheet filled with numbers and marketing strategies. He was a 42-year-old marketing director, focused and driven by his career. His life seemed perfect. He had a successful job, a beautiful home, and a loving wife, Sophie. Sophie, an architect, was 38, and they had been married for 8 years. They had built a life together, filled with routine and comfort. But lately something had been missing for Eric. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a quiet, nagging feeling that something in his marriage wasn't right. Sophie had always been the more ambitious one, often working long hours at her firm. She was passionate about her career, and Eric admired her drive. But the longer their marriage went on, the more he noticed that their time together was becoming scarce. They rarely shared meals without the intrusion of work talk, and evenings that used to be filled with easy conversations now felt distant. He longed for the connection they once had, but it seemed to be slipping away, unnoticed. That night, after a simple dinner, Sophie surprised him with a suggestion. "How about we invite Sarah over this weekend?" she asked, her voice casual yet filled with excitement. Eric was caught off guard. "Sarah?" he asked, trying to place the name. "Who's Sarah?" Sophie smiled, her eyes brightening as she explained. "She's an old friend from college, back in Seattle. We recently reconnected, and I thought it would be nice for her to come visit." Eric paused, sensing a bit of hesitation in her tone. He had never heard about Sarah before, and it seemed strange that Sophie would suddenly want to reconnect with someone from her past without mentioning it earlier. But Sophie was enthusiastic, and after a moment of silence, he agreed. "Sure," he said, though a faint unease began to stir in him. "Sounds good." Sophie's excitement was palpable as she made plans for the weekend, and Eric couldn't help but notice how different she seemed that evening. She moved around the house with a lightness he hadn't seen in weeks, her energy infectious. He, on the other hand, found himself lost in thought, the quiet unease settling deeper in his chest. Why hadn't she mentioned Sarah before? And why did this sudden decision feel so secretive? The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Sophie was more lively than usual, putting effort into making the house look perfect. Eric tried to push aside his growing doubts. Perhaps he was overthinking things. After all, Sophie had always been close to her friends, and reconnecting with someone from her past might just be what she needed to feel more balanced in her life. When Saturday arrived, Eric tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort. He waited anxiously in the living room as Sophie prepared for Sarah's arrival. As the doorbell rang, Sophie rushed to answer it, a wide smile on her face. Eric stood up, offering a polite smile, but there was something about the situation that didn't sit right with him. The woman who entered was elegant, with an aura of confidence that immediately filled the room. Sarah, as Sophie had promised, was indeed beautiful, but there was more to her than just looks. There was an energy between her and Sophie, something unspoken that Eric couldn't ignore. As they exchanged pleasantries, Eric's mind raced. Sophie and Sarah embraced like old friends, but their closeness struck him as more than just friendly. It was intimate. Too intimate for friends who hadn't seen each other in years. Over the course of the evening, as the three of them sat down for dinner, Eric tried his best to remain engaged. But the conversation between Sophie and Sarah flowed with such ease, a comfortable, almost secretive rhythm that left Eric on the outside. He felt like a stranger in his own home. The jokes, the shared memories, the knowing glances, it was all a bit too much for him. Later that night, after the two women went to bed, Eric lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why was Sophie acting so differently? Why had she kept Sarah a secret until now? Something was brewing beneath the surface, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know what it was. He reached over to Sophie's side of the bed, his fingers brushing the edge of her phone. He hesitated, then made the decision to unlock it. Sophie had always been open about her phone, so it didn't feel like a betrayal, just a gut feeling that told him something was amiss. As the phone screen lit up, Eric's heart raced. He scrolled through the messages and found a thread between Sophie and Sarah that sent a chill down his spine. The messages weren't just friendly banter. There were words that spoke of shared memories, moments that went beyond friendship, intimate, secret conversations. And as Eric read further, his stomach dropped. It wasn't just a reunion of old friends. Sophie and Sarah had once been more than that, and their connection had never truly faded. They had been in a relationship years ago. A secret relationship. And now it seemed they had rekindled it. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His mind reeled with the shock of it all. The woman he loved, his wife, had been hiding this from him. She had been hiding Sarah, hiding their past, and now she was still hiding her. He set the phone down slowly, the weight of what he had just uncovered sinking deep into his chest. The perfect life he thought he had was shattered in an instant. The trust he had in Sophie in their marriage was gone. The woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew, was someone entirely different than the one who had stood beside him for the past 8 years. Eric closed his eyes, the anger and betrayal flooding his veins. He didn't know what to do with himself, didn't know where to go from here. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the discovery was a blur of confusion and turmoil. Eric woke up with a heaviness in his chest, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. Sophie was already up, moving around the kitchen with an energy that only added to his discomfort. She hummed to herself as she made coffee, her back turned to him, unaware of the storm that had just torn through his world. Eric lay in bed for a moment, his mind racing. His fingers traced the edge of Sophie's phone, still sitting on the nightstand, as if it were an extension of the betrayal he had just uncovered. The messages were still fresh in his mind. Sarah, his wife's former lover, now back in her life. He felt nauseous, the realization sinking in deeper with each passing second. Why had Sophie kept this from him? Why had she invited Sarah over so suddenly? The question gnawed at him, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt like a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. Finally, he couldn't stay still any longer. He got out of bed and made his way downstairs, finding Sophie still focused on the coffee machine. She was humming again, seemingly lost in her own thoughts, and the simple act of making breakfast felt so ordinary in contrast to the chaos swirling inside him. "Good morning," she said, her voice light and casual. Eric tried to answer, but his words caught in his throat. He looked at Sophie, studying her face, the woman he thought he knew so well, and yet in that moment she felt like a stranger. His heart ached with the weight of his discovery, and though he wanted to shout, to demand answers, he found himself frozen. He finally spoke, his voice steady but strained. "Sophie, who is Sarah to you?" Sophie's back stiffened. She didn't turn around immediately, but her hands froze on the coffee pot. She let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh before facing him. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe fear. "She's just an old friend," Sophie replied, but the answer was too quick, too rehearsed. Eric could tell she was hiding something, and the tension in the room thickened. Eric stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her. "An old friend? Is that all she is?" Sophie paused, a long silence stretching between them. "Eric, But before she could continue, Eric cut her off. "I know, Sophie. I know about you and Sarah. I know what you've been hiding." Her eyes widened, and Eric could see her muscles tense as she stood still, trapped in the moment. The words felt like they were strangling him. He had never imagined he would be in this position, confronting the woman he loved about her secret past with someone else. Sophie opened her mouth, then closed it again. I never meant for you to find out this way," she said softly, her voice shaking. She glanced down at the floor as though searching for something to hold on to. "It was a long time ago. I thought it was over, and then she came back into my life. I didn't know how to tell you." Eric's chest tightened as he tried to digest her words. "How long, Sophie? How long has this been going on?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time in years, Eric saw vulnerability in her gaze. "It's been a few months. We reconnected. It wasn't planned, but I didn't know what to do. I felt torn, Eric. I didn't know who to choose. I thought I could have both, but..." Her voice trailed off, and Eric felt a sharp pang in his chest. The pain was unbearable. Sophie, his wife, had been living a double life, and all along he had been blind to it. The woman he had trusted, the one he had built a life with, had betrayed him in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. "I don't know what to say," Sophie continued, her voice quieter now. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I've been so confused. Between you and Sarah, between my past and my present, I didn't know where to turn." Eric took a step back, his hands clenched into fists. His thoughts swirled in a tornado of hurt and anger. He had spent years with Sophie, building a life, making plans for the future. And now, all of that felt like it had been built on lies. The foundation had cracked, and the entire structure was crumbling before him. "I need space," Eric finally said, his voice firm, though it trembled with emotion. "I need some time to think about all of this." Sophie nodded, her face etched with sorrow. "I understand. I've messed up, Eric. I know that. But please don't leave me. We can fix this." But Eric wasn't sure if anything could be fixed. He had never felt so lost, so utterly betrayed. He turned away from Sophie, his heart breaking with every step he took. He needed to get out, to escape from the suffocating air of their home, from the life he thought he knew. Later that afternoon, as Sophie tried to reach out to apologize, Eric packed his things. He couldn't stay there. The walls felt too close, the memories too painful. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay in a house that no longer felt like home. By evening, Eric had found himself in an apartment in the Pearl District. The apartment was small, minimalist, but it was his. It felt like the first step toward a new life, even though he didn't know what that life would look like. He sat in silence, staring out at the city lights, the weight of the past few days sinking in. The perfect life he thought he had was gone. The future he had imagined with Sophie was now just a distant memory, slipping through his fingers. And now he had to figure out what came next. The days after Eric moved into the small apartment in the Pearl District passed in a haze. The silence of his new surroundings was deafening. He had spent years building a life with Sophie, one filled with routines and shared memories, but now he found himself surrounded by empty walls, trying to adjust to a new reality. The pain in his chest didn't ease. It felt like a weight that he couldn't shake, pressing down on him with every passing hour. At first, there were the constant attempts by Sophie to reach out. She called, texted, and even showed up at his apartment a few times, pleading for him to come back to talk, to work through the mess they had created. Each time Eric felt torn. Part of him still loved her, still remembered the woman he had married, the woman who had once made him feel like he was the center of her world. But that woman was gone. She had betrayed him in a way that left him questioning everything. The worst part was the lack of closure. Sophie hadn't even apologized for what had happened with Sarah. She had explained, of course, her confusion, her torn feelings, but the apology seemed hollow. It felt more like an explanation than a true reckoning. She hadn't acknowledged the depth of the hurt she had caused, the trust she had shattered. Eric didn't respond to her attempts to reconcile. He needed space. Time to clear his head and figure out what he wanted, or if he even wanted anything to do with her anymore. For the first time in years, he found himself focusing entirely on his work. At the marketing firm where he had spent most of his career, Eric threw himself into the projects he had been putting off for months. His boss noticed the change in him, but Eric's drive and commitment didn't go unnoticed. His new focus on his career became his escape. He threw himself into the whirlwind of deadlines, meetings, and strategy sessions, pushing his personal life further and further out of his mind. Despite his professional success, however, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the void that Sophie had left behind. Every now and then, when he returned to his apartment late at night, the silence was deafening. He would catch himself staring at the small kitchen, remembering the nights he and Sophie had spent there, cooking dinner, laughing over a glass of wine. But now that was all gone. One night, as Eric sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, he noticed a new message from an unknown number. It was Sophie's name, but the text wasn't from her. It was from Sarah. "Eric, I know this isn't easy, but I want to explain. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, but I think you deserve to know the truth. I know Sophie is struggling, but she's not the only one who has been confused. Please, let's talk." Eric's stomach churned. He hadn't expected to hear from Sarah. He had never really given her much thought. After all, Sophie was the one he had married, the one who had betrayed him. But now, Sarah's message, though laced with guilt, felt like another layer of the betrayal he had already felt. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat there, staring at the screen, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He hadn't wanted to involve Sarah. Sophie had been the one he married. But now, it seemed like both of them were tangled in the mess they had created. He thought about it for a long time. Finally, after a few minutes, he typed a short reply. "I don't want to hear from you. This is between me and Sophie." He hit send and immediately regretted it. Maybe Sarah had her own part to play in all of this. Maybe she had been the catalyst, but Sophie was the one who had made the choice. Sophie was the one who had broken his heart. The next few days passed in a blur of work and isolation. Sophie's calls became fewer, and Eric didn't mind. He needed the space. He needed to clear his head. But as the weeks went by, he started to feel the weight of loneliness. He hadn't reached out to anyone since moving into the apartment, save for a few casual work-related conversations. He hadn't gone out to dinner, hadn't socialized. He had isolated himself in the shell of his apartment, unable to shake the sense of betrayal that lingered like a shadow. Meanwhile, Sophie's life was spiraling downward in ways Eric hadn't anticipated. The scandal of their breakup had hit the media, and Sophie found herself fired from her high-profile job at the architectural firm. She had tried to save face, to regain some semblance of control, but the fallout was undeniable. Her reputation, once flawless, was now tarnished. She found herself facing the consequences of her actions in a way that no amount of apology could erase. Despite all the turmoil, Sophie didn't give up. She tried to salvage what was left of her life. She spent hours looking for a new job, meeting with lawyers to discuss the divorce proceedings, and attempting to rebuild her life from the ground up. But the loneliness she felt, the shame, was suffocating. She was living in the same world, but it felt like she was now an outsider, struggling, alone, and regretful. As weeks turned into months, Eric started to feel like he was moving forward. He didn't feel whole yet, but he was starting to piece together a new life. His focus on work was unwavering, and he began to engage more in the community. He took up running, joined a local gym, and even started volunteering at a shelter. It was the small things, the little acts of kindness and self-care, that began to heal the wounds that Sophie had left behind. Yet, every now and then, in quiet moments before sleep, he would think of her. He would wonder how she was doing, whether she regretted everything, whether there was still a part of her that missed him. But those thoughts faded quickly, replaced by the reality that they had no future together. The woman he had known, the woman he had married, had chosen someone else. And that was something he could never forget. The months after the separation felt like a blur to Eric. The pace of his life had shifted, faster perhaps, but also quieter. The noise that had once filled his days was now absent, and in its place, he had found something new: peace. His apartment in the Pearl District, small but cozy, became a sanctuary. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. For the first time in a long time, Eric was living on his own terms, without the weight of someone else's choices hanging over him. The work was demanding but rewarding. He threw himself into marketing strategies, finding satisfaction in meeting deadlines, crafting campaigns, and executing them flawlessly. His colleagues admired his focus, and Eric felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just the husband trying to keep everything together. He was Eric, the director, the professional, the man who had rediscovered his own worth outside the confines of a marriage that had crumbled. Even though work consumed most of his energy, Eric also made time for the things that gave him joy. He joined a local running club and ran nearly every morning, feeling the rush of endorphins with each mile. He took up painting on weekends, an old hobby he had abandoned years ago when life with Sophie had become all-encompassing. At the shelter, he spent hours volunteering, helping with anything from serving food to offering a listening ear to those in need. Slowly, piece by piece, he began to rebuild his sense of self, finding strength in the small moments that made up his new life. But despite all his efforts, despite the busy days and the newfound hobbies, there were moments when loneliness crept in. It wasn't as overwhelming as it once was, but it lingered, especially during the quiet evenings when he would sit at his small dining table eating alone. He had learned to live with it, to accept that solitude was now a part of his life, but it didn't make the ache go away entirely. One evening, several months after his move, as Eric sat down to dinner, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number again. This time, though, it wasn't from Sophie or Sarah. It was from a number he vaguely recognized, a name he hadn't thought about in months: Sarah. "Eric, I know things between us have been difficult, and I understand why you don't want to talk to me. But I need you to know that I never meant to cause you pain. I've left Portland. I'm in Seattle now, trying to put my life back together. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry, and I hope, one day, you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Eric stared at the message for a long time, his fingers hovering over the phone's screen. He hadn't expected to hear from Sarah again. In some way he had hoped he wouldn't. She had been a catalyst in the storm that had upended his life, and now her apology felt like a small, distant offering in a world that had moved on. He knew he should ignore it, move forward, and leave the past where it belonged. But something in Sarah's message struck him differently this time. It wasn't just an apology, it was a realization. Sarah, too, had been trying to rebuild her life. She was no longer just Sophie's past. She was her own person, struggling with her own consequences. He didn't know what to say, but after a few moments of silence, Eric typed back, "Thank you for reaching out, Sarah. I don't know if I can ever forgive what happened, but I'm not angry anymore. I've moved on. I hope you find the peace you're looking for." He hit send and put the phone down, feeling a small weight lift off his shoulders. Maybe forgiveness wasn't for Sarah. Maybe it was for him. Letting go of the bitterness, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it was the final step in his journey of healing. Days turned into weeks and the seasons began to change. Eric had started to feel whole again, but there was a piece of his heart that had been left behind, a piece that still remembered the man he had been when he was with Sophie. He didn't want to forget that version of himself, the one that had loved with an open heart, the one who had believed in the possibility of forever. But he also knew that Eric, the man sitting in his apartment now, was someone stronger. Someone who had faced heartbreak, faced betrayal, and come out on the other side with more clarity than he had ever known. And he was proud of that version of himself. Meanwhile, Sophie's life had taken an entirely different trajectory. After months of struggling with the fallout from their divorce, she had managed to land a new job in another city, a position that allowed her to rebuild her career from the ground up. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but Sophie had found some semblance of stability again. She had moved into a small apartment in another part of Portland, far from Eric and the memories they had shared. There were moments when Sophie thought about reaching out to Eric, to apologize one last time, but she knew it would never be the same. She had lost him, and no amount of words could undo what she had done. Sophie was learning, slowly but surely, that some things in life could never be fixed. Some things had to be let go. Eric too had let go. He had stopped thinking about the past so much, and as time passed, it became easier to accept the way things had unfolded. Life moved on, and so did he. His focus was now on his future, a future that was no longer tied to the person he had once loved. He had started dating again. Nothing serious, but enough to remind him that he was worthy of love, that his heart was still capable of opening to someone new. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but Eric was learning that the process of healing, of moving on, was just as important as the love he had given before. And though he would always remember Sophie, always carry a part of her with him, Eric had finally found peace. It was a peace he had never thought possible when he first walked out of their home. But now, as he sat in his small apartment on a quiet evening, watching the city lights twinkle outside his window, he understood what it meant to truly let go. And so life moved on.